So welcome to the fourth session of the Tree Trooper training. Tonight is going to be pretty jam-packed with how to put planting plans together. So Brittany's going to start us off. We'll have time for questions and answers from her presentation to start. And then I'm hoping you all had an opportunity to review the GIS links that we've had up for the last few weeks. And I'm going to walk through how to put together a pretty simple site plan using the county GIS. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Brittany and we'll go from there.
All right, let me just set my screen up. Great, and hopefully you guys can see the slides. So thanks for coming tonight. Today I'm going to talk about developing planting plans, organizing events, and accessing resources. And this is the fourth webinar in the Tree Trooper training, and I believe Gray or Josh is going to be giving a presentation next Wednesday. And then after that, we're going to have a field portion next month. So we're going to jump back into using that urban watershed forestry manual that we used in the second presentation. And I'll be bringing hard copies of both of these books to the field day. So if you're interested in a hard copy, just let someone know and I'll just make sure to bring enough copies. So far we talked about picking the right tree for the right spot and making sure you pick a species that's going to thrive on that site based on the soil, the light, and the water conditions. We also talked about planting the tree in the correct spot, and you can do this by doing a site assessment first to figure out what the best location is, and you want to also avoid any planting conflicts like trees or buildings. Then we started talking about the right time and the right way to plant a tree. You want to plant in the fall or the spring and avoid summer because it's usually too hot and too dry. We want to avoid winter when the ground is frozen. There's different types of stock. There's ball and burlap, there's bare root, and there's container. We also learned the correct way to plant and care for a tree. So you want to leave that root collar exposed when you're planting. You want to dig a hole 2 to 3 times the size of the root ball. You want to water the tree. You want to add tree protection. You want to mulch correctly. And then if you're pruning, you only want to prune those critical branches. And that brings us to developing a planting plan. And a planting plan is where we really bring everything together. We bring together that site assessment, the different types of species, and planting directions, maintenance, and a bunch more. So we're going to go through everything that should be included in a planting plan. So the planting plan information can be found in chapter 3 of that urban watershed forestry manual. And the planting plan is really what you need to make a planting successful. All plans are going to look different, but there's just some key features that every plan should include. And I'm going to go through these step by step. So I'm just going to name them real quick. You want to have a map, you want to list your species, you want to have planting directions and instructions. You want an equipment and supply list. You want to include site prep instructions. You want to have an implementation and a maintenance schedule. And you also want to include a cost estimate. So I'm going to go through a planting plan that I've written for one of our programs called Healthy Forest, Healthy Waters. It's a reforestation program for private landowners, and some of it is blacked out just to keep the property owner private. And this is the cover page, which just has basic information and includes the planting program, the location, the landowner name and contact, the watershed name, the county, and then it also includes like an acreage breakdown, which includes the planting boundary and just a simple date that you know when you planted it. And you want to start with your objective, just like an overview and history of the site. You want to mention any funding assistance, the size of the planting, and any goals you might have. So for this landowner, they wanted a mix of evergreen and deciduous trees. We planted berry fruit-producing trees, we planted flowering trees, and we planted some oaks. And the goal was really to improve water quality, create wildlife habitat, and just to create something pleasing to look at. And then a site description. This is going to come right from your site assessment. And in this section, you're just going to basically explain the site. This landowner is planting 2.8 acres. It's an old field that has been mowed down. There's a wet spot towards the south planting boundary, and there's also a waterway that we don't want to plant. There's also a sensitive species, the dwarf wedge mussel is nearby. So it's just good to note everything you know about the site and everything you see in your site assessment. And then soils. Soils are required to know in the first place in order to pick your tree species. And it's important to know things like if you have any wet spots or dry areas. And we talked about using that web soil survey online to understand your soils. I also suggest that you get a soil test, and the county mapping tool that Josh is going to show you, that should also include the soil information. So you don't even have to use the web soil survey, but if you just wanted to check two sources, you could. And then, and when you use these online sources, you should always go out and check what's actually out there on the ground. Sometimes they don't update it necessarily. I think Web Soil Survey tries to do it every year, but you know, you can only get so much done. And this is a soil map that I made for this landowner, and it's pretty simple. The Web Soil Survey will give this to you after you select your area of interest, and the orange is the soils, the green is the property boundary, and the red is the planting boundary. And then that blue circle at the bottom is that wet area that I mentioned before. And then site preparation. You want to include any work that needs to be done before planting. So you might need to mow, you might have to clean up litter, you might have to treat invasive species. So you can avoid that picture of all that mile a minute down there on the bottom right-hand corner. And then this site, for this landowner, this was machine planted with bare root seedlings. You're most likely going to be hand planting with larger container trees. And this site was also treated with herbicide around each seedling to suppress competition from the surrounding weeds for the first growing season. And that's typically common in large rural reforestation sites. And instructions. You basically want to tell somebody how to plant the site. You want to include how it's going to get planted, who's going to be digging the holes, how it's going to get watered, who's going to do the watering, how the species are spaced apart, how they're laid out. And these trees for this plan, they were bare root seedlings, they were machine planted. The wet tolerant species were placed in that wet area along that south planting boundary that I talked about. And then we kept the smaller and shade intolerant trees on the outside edge of the planting to kind of create like a soft edge effect. And we wanted to keep the waterway unplanted. And we also kept a drive path around the planting. We do this on really large plantings just in case there's some type of an emergency and the fire department has to come in because there's a fire or something. So you always want to make sure you can drive around your planting, but it's really more for, you know, larger sites. And then you also want to include any tree protection that's required. So in this plan, I included what species got tree tubes and how many were required for each species. You should also include directions on how to install the tree protection and any materials you might need. You should only shelter hardwood trees and shrubs. You don't want to use a tube on evergreens or shrubs because they grow too wide. If you have a wide plant like a shrub or an evergreen or a large container tree, you should use wire caging, like in that bottom left picture. And then it's good to include the seedling order and information like who's picking up the trees or when they plan to get delivered. You want, if you have nursery coming from, if you have plants coming from different nurseries, you're gonna wanna list those nurseries and their phone numbers. And you also wanna include the day and the time that they're getting delivered if you're not gonna pick them up. And material cost. This is where I record all of my purchases. It's super helpful, especially if you're using grant money, because you can keep track of what you're spending. And the site that I did this plan for was machine planted by a contractor, and there was no mulching. So supplies on this list is going to probably look a lot different than some of the more urban plantings, but you should include everything that you're going to need in your materials list. And then this is a budget worksheet that's in the watershed forestry manual. So you can just use this budget. It's super helpful. Like I said, if you're applying for grants, so you can keep track of everything. And then you should also include a supplies and a materials list. This type of planting, the type of planting is going to determine what type of tools you're going to need. And it's important to make sure you have enough tools for everyone, especially if you're doing like a volunteer planting, or you have to make sure that they're going to bring their own tools. And then we talked about maps previously, and you definitely want to include the map in your planting plan. This is a simple one that I did for this site. It shows the planting boundary, the waterway, and that wet area where the wet tolerant species should be planted. And there are some guides in your book, as I mentioned before, but Josh is going to show you how to use that GIS tool and make a map of your own. And this is just some imagery that I pulled from Google Maps. And before you plant any trees, you're gonna have to think about your site assessment, and you should try to lay your trees out on a map like this. You can see this area over here has some compaction. There's a road here. Looks like there's a fence here and here. And then this looks like a basketball court or a tennis court or something. You also have some shading going over here for because of those existing trees. So you're going to want to make sure you plant what's appropriate for that site. And you can simply add in shapes and colors to represent what you want planted. The yellow are 3-gallon, partially shade-tolerant shrubs because they're up against that hedgerow. The blue dots are large canopy trees, and then the green represents a row of medium-sized shrubs. And it's just good to add as much information as possible, especially if you're working with a contractor or if you're working with volunteers. And always check for planting conflicts and consider spacing. You should try to be 3 feet from fencing or pavement. You want to be 15 feet from any buildings or trees, and 30 feet from any overhead wires. And these numbers are really just guides. You always want to check how tall your tree gets and how wide your tree gets, or your shrub, before you plant it, just to make sure it has enough room. And maintenance is very important. And you can plant the tree perfect, but it may not survive if you don't take care of it. You want to take care of the tree until it starts to establish, and this is typically about 3 years. Maintenance includes watering throughout the spring and the fall. Urban plantings, they need a lot more water just because those areas tend to be hotter, more stressful, and you're usually planting larger stock. So larger stock means more root mass, which requires more water. You're going to want to maintain any tree protection. You want to straighten any shelters or restake any stakes if you need to. We usually don't stake trees for support. You want them to move around in the wind and add support wood, like we talked about in that first lecture, where they need it. And you don't want to keep, and if you are staking, don't keep it on for too long, because as soon as you take it off, the tree might fall over. So you only want to stake it for about 1 year. And then you also want to keep up with mowing to reduce that competition until the tree is established, and inspect any branches for like insects or disease or any health problems. And then there's a management schedule, and this is important for the future. And it's basically a timeline, so it's start to finish. And this should include things like site prep, so mowing or treating invasive species, when the site's going to be planted, how to care for the trees over time. And it's always good to do a survival check to see how your trees are doing and if they need to be replaced. You should also always be monitoring for invasive species just to make sure they don't get out of control. So now I'm going to talk about organizing volunteer planting events. The goal of this training is to train you to be the tree planting leaders in your community. Hopefully most everyone has projects going in at the end of the training with Replant Anne Arundel, but I'm also hoping that you continue to seek sites and funding sources to get other areas in the county planted or anywhere. And when you're planning an event, it's really important to come up with a game plan so the day of the event isn't chaotic. So when I'm planning out an event, I always keep in mind the supplies I'm going to need, make sure there's clear communication, I demonstrate the planting, make sure that there's mulch available and there's water available. You always want to take in consideration safety. Refreshments are always good to have, and bathrooms, of course. Weather can be unpredictable, so you want to plan ahead for weather. And then you're going to want to do a planting inspection and then just have a future maintenance plan. So this is a volunteer reforestation site, and I get it looks pretty chaotic at first, but if you look closely, everything's pretty laid out. We created an assembly line because people were showing up at different times of the day, so it was easier just to have everything laid out. And assembly lines typically work the best. Someone plants, or someone digs the hole, someone plants the tree, someone comes in after, they water it, they mulch it, and they shelter it. So an assembly line looks really great, works really great. And these are some large trees that were just set up and laid out ahead of time. There's no holes dug yet, but they are laid out where they're supposed to go. And it's nice to always just lay your trees out like this because it's not too late to make adjustments. And you can see in the back there that the mulch is set up. There's some tree stakes back there. So everything is ready to go for the volunteers, and they can just focus on digging those holes. And I recommend demonstrating the whole process. I usually ask what everyone's skill level is, but no matter what their skill level is, I still encourage everyone to watch the demonstration, because even if you think you know how to plant, it's still worth a listen because you could learn something new. Maybe you could teach me something new. So it's important to take the time to demonstrate how to plant the tree so you don't have to go back and fix a mistake later. And this is a planting in Pennsylvania that we did. And this guide is just showing the group of high school students how to plant. And you can see that he's holding the tree correctly because he's holding it by the container. And the holes for this site were pre-dug. So at this point, the volunteers just have to plant them and add mulch and water them and add some tree protection. And you can see now that the guy demonstrating is just digging down to that root collar and removing that extra medium on top that the nursery has placed over time. And now he's taking off the container and he's going to be breaking up the roots, and you should prune any encircling roots if you need to. And then you also want to make sure that the tree is level and the root collar is not buried. So that tree looks pretty good to me. And if you don't have a planting plan, or if it's not clear or detailed enough, you could have some miscommunications. And this is a site in Pennsylvania where the contractor augured the holes ahead of time without knowing the size of the tree. And you can see that the hole is very big and that tree is very small. You can see the small containerized seedling in front of the dog there. So the tree is going to do fine in a hole like that, but that's a lot of backfill to have to put in. It's probably going to sink down a little bit when all that dirt settles. So if something like this happens to you, I'd probably plant that tree a little bit higher, not drastically higher. Just anticipate it sinking down a little bit because you had to put so much fill back in there, and make sure you push that soil down so it has a firm bottom. So this is the correct size hole for a tree that size. It's about 2 to 3 times the diameter of the container. And you can see that these volunteers are holding that tree correctly, and they're holding it by the container, not the trunk. And you also need to figure out how you're going to get supplies to a site. You're probably going to have mulch, you're going to have stakes, you're going to have cages, you're going to need water. And in this picture, you can see that they drove right up on top of that planting site that they just planted. And this isn't the best idea because you're compacting that soil and you risk just driving over the trees you just planted. So it's better if you get a wheelbarrow and load up your materials outside of the planting boundary, just to avoid that extra compaction and possibly hurting the trees. So you can see these volunteers are using a wheelbarrow to move the mulch to the site, so there's going to be less compaction. And it's important to train volunteers how to mulch properly. We see incorrect mulching all the time. So always check the mulch at the end of the day to make sure there's no mulch volcanoes like on the left. And you always want to practice safety. Try to keep one person to a shelter. There's no need for multiple people to be around while you're pounding stakes. This picture is a very bad example of safety. The 2 people holding the stake, they're too close together. And they're too close to the person driving the stake. And the person driving the stake isn't even holding the mallet correctly. So you want to keep one person to a shelter. It doesn't need to be a 2-person job to drive a stake. And shovels and pruners, they're also really sharp and accidents can happen. So always just reinforce safety throughout the day and, keep a first aid kit nearby. And weather can be super unpredictable. You want to make sure your volunteers know what to bring. You can plant in the snow if it's shallow, like they're doing there. And if the ground isn't frozen. We plant a lot in March and we can still get snow during this time. We had a few plantings this year that were postponed in March due to weather. So you should always have a backup plan if the weather's, going to be bad. And always provide a list of volunteers that include what they need to bring. So if they need boots, gloves, rain jackets, water, sunscreen, more information, the better. And then you need a plan for watering. Who's going to water the site? Where is the water coming from? Is there a fire hydrant nearby that the fire department can help you with? Can the county help you do it? Can the park help you do it? Or is there a stream nearby? Water is a major component of plantings, and it's definitely important. So you want to make sure you have a water source. And it's important to take breaks when you're doing volunteer events. You want to let volunteers know where the bathrooms are, if there are any. And it's always just nice to bring snacks for everyone. It's important to make it fun and non-stressful because people are coming out to help plant trees on their own time, and you just want everyone to have a good time and have a good experience and be happy. And this checklist is out of the book. Whoever runs the planting should check these off at the end of the volunteer planting. It's much easier to fix mistakes at the time of planting rather than a couple weeks or years later. And you want to ask yourself, is it planted to the correct height? Is the tree shelter installed correctly? Is it mulched correctly? Has the tree been watered? These are all very important questions. And then this is also in the back of the book, and it's a long-term inspection list. So you want to check for health and signs of damage. You want to monitor for invasive species, inspect shelters to see if they need to be fixed or replaced, and just do a survival check, evaluate the mortality of any trees, and see if you need to replace any of them. So accessing resources, we all have these great sites to plant. We have all these ideas, but how do we find support and funding to get them planted? And the Chesapeake Tree Canopy Network is a great resource. It's run by the Alliance, the U.S. Forest Service, and the Chesapeake Bay Program. And it includes funding source information, educational resources, and it also includes a section on tree stewards. And the Tree Stewards page has a lot of information on other programs like this Tree Troopers program. Other groups include the Pennsylvania Tree Tenders, Virginia Tree Stewards, and Casey Trees in DC. They're all similar programs to this, and hopefully we'll get Maryland up on there soon. And Forest for the Bay is another site by the Alliance that's an educational website for woodland owners. And we send out a monthly newsletter with a lot of good information. And I would highly recommend this site, even if you don't have a woodland and are just interested in trees. That newsletter is definitely a great read. We have a lot of facts in there. I learn a lot from it, so it's definitely something to sign up for. And then our coworker out in Pennsylvania, his name is Ryan Davis, and he also does monthly tree talk videos. These are short 5-minute videos on native trees, and Ryan talks about the history and the features of the tree. He goes out hiking with his wife and his dog, his beagle there, and it's a simple video. He just talks, and they're really good. And you can find those on YouTube if you search Tree Talk and Forest for the Bay. And if you need help finding any of this stuff, just let me know, and I can walk you through it. So I'm going to finish up with some funding opportunities. I'm going to start with MUCFC, which is the Maryland Urban and Community Forestry Committee. And they fund tree plantings and education. And they offer up to $1,000 per project. And the money is awarded to organizations or volunteer-based groups, so like schools or HOAs. The money can't be awarded to individual citizens, so you have to be a group. So a group of volunteers like the Tree Troopers would most likely be able to apply. And it's for planting on public lands and parks and cities, towns, or just like community open spaces. There's also Tremendous Maryland, and that offers discounted container trees. And it's a partnership between American Natives Nursery and the Maryland Forest Service. There's typically a fall and a spring order form, and these are container trees. The contact is Ann Gilbert with the Maryland Forest Service. So if you have any questions, you can ask her. I can probably help you out with this too, but specific questions, she'd probably be a better help. And then the Maryland Forest Service also offers the Marylanders Plant Trees coupon, and it's $25 off a tree purchased from a participating nursery. And that list can be found on the Forest Service website. And these trees must be planted on private property. There's also the Backyard Buffer Program, and this is between Maryland DNR and Anne Arundel Watershed Stewards Academy. I actually ran this program for Kent and Queen Anne's County, but it's offered throughout most of the state. And it's an awesome program. You get a bag of 25 to 35 bare root tree seedlings at no cost to plant on private property. And I believe Anne Arundel even does different bags. So if you have a dry area or a wet area, or you want like a pollinator habitat bag, they figured all that out. So it's a really awesome program. I highly suggest if you have some space in your yard and some time to maintain some bare root seedlings, you definitely pick up a pack. And then there's the Keep Maryland Beautiful grants. They have a few different ones, but this one's called Clean Up Green Up, and it funds public tree plantings up to 5,000. And you must apply as a group. You can't apply as an individual citizen. So you would have to be like part of a volunteer group or something. And it's a partnership between the Maryland Department of Transportation and the Maryland Environmental Trust. And I listed the contact email there if you have more questions about this program. And then this is the last one. The Alliance, through this program, is offering a mini grant opportunity for any tree troopers that want to get together and fund a project in the area. It must be an urban site, and well, it must be an urban site. It can't be on private property. And there's no minimum or maximum acres, and there's no required type of tree stock. We just, we want it to take place on public land or community open space, and we can offer up to $2,000 a project. You would need to apply by submitting a planting plan, a detailed budget, a maintenance plan, and a short narrative on the project. And if you're interested, just let me know. We could probably fund 1 to 2 projects depending on if we get any requests. Just something to think about. And that's all I have.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Brittany. Yet again, another phenomenal presentation. Thank you for sharing all of your knowledge with us. All right, so I
welcome.
have a couple of questions. The first one that I saw came in from Gavin. Gavin, if you wanted to unmute and ask your question.
Yeah, I'm gonna have to double check. Oh yeah, so you talked about the rural replanting of the fallow field, and just wondering if there's like any place that talks about, you know, what percentage of, you know, formerly agricultural sites are being reforested, you know, just as a matter of curiosity.
I don't have that number off the top of my head. We're definitely always trying to reforest agricultural sites. There's a lot of different federal and state programs out there that aim to reforest rural lands, especially like on the Eastern Shore.
Okay, sounds good. I mean, that's fair. But if you come across anything, you know, be interested.
Okay, sure.
Okay, and then next I saw, I think, a couple of questions come in from Bill Mitchell. Bill, if you wanted to unmute.
Hi. Yeah, I had number one, that looked like an awful lot of handwork digging all those holes. Did you use an auger for that? I was just curious about that. And the other thing was, let me see here. Oh, yeah, you were talking about using wheelbarrows rather than a truck to distribute the material. And I thought it might be a good idea if you could spread the piles of the materials throughout the site so that it would be accessible by wheelbarrow and it could be done by hand.
Yeah, one thing I suggest for the mulch, you could drive the perimeter of the site and, you know, dump some piles here and there, so it would be less of a walk.
Yeah.
We just don't want you to be driving up and down the rows just because you could run over a seedling and you're compacting that soil. But you can definitely just be careful about it. You can do little piles so it's easier to grab that mulch or whatever supplies you need. And then you can auger holes, definitely. You know, sometimes if you need really big holes or if the ground's really hard, you might not be able to use a hand auger. You might have to put the auger on front of a tractor. I know the county usually has that type of equipment if you're partnering with the county. But for bare root seedlings, they're usually planted by hand with a planting bar. So it looks like a spade. You just shove it in the ground because you don't really need a big hole for a bare root seedling. Or they're machine planted, but that's more typical on the Eastern Shore. I'm pretty sure the Eastern Shore is the only area in Maryland that machine plants bare root seedlings.
Yeah, just like a thousand holes like on that one. I thought, wow, you know, that's a lot of digging, and that's asking a lot from a group of volunteers, you know.
Yeah, the plan I showed you was a really large reforestation site, so that is going to be a little different than some of your volunteer plantings.
It was great though. Thanks. Good presentation. I liked it.
Thank you.
Great. And then next, I saw a couple of questions come in from Renee. If you wanted to unmute, I think you're still here.
Yep,
Yep.
Hey, thanks, Brittany. First question, I was interested in that example you gave of the rural mass planting. My sister did exactly that on the Eastern Shore, as you described, machine planting, that 8-foot spacing, similar to the plan you showed. And I'm assuming that the reason for the close spacing is to adjust for possible mortality, which could be expected in that situation. But in her case, like everything grew in. And so what do you, and so she's basically, what do you typically do for that situation? Because I didn't see that kind of factored into a plan for a rural landscape where you're so successful now, things are growing in too thickly. Do you provide a recommendation to the homeowner or landowner as far as at this year you may want to transplant every other tree or remove the tree, or just how do you address that? And that was my first question, and I'll follow up with my second after that one.
Okay. So you would have a management plan. Typically, if you're reforesting a large area like that, someone's going to write a plan for you. The Forest Service typically does it, especially if you have cost share on it.
Yeah.
So it's going to have a management practice schedule. And when well, it depends who you're talking to, but I used to call 70% survival on a planting like that. So we would plant 544 seedlings to the acre, and that's a lot. And we expect them to get eaten by deer. We expect them to get mowed over. We expect them to just get lost, just because of all the competition. So we go back typically around 15, 20 years. We'll do something called a crop tree release. So you're going to go in, and this is just a management practice, and you're going to go in and pick your best quality trees, the nicest form. You don't, if an invasive could have came in, you don't want to pick that one. So just the nicest trees for wildlife, for whatever your goals are. And then you get rid of the trees on 3 sides of that tree. So you like split it in a quadrant and remove trees on 3 sides. So it has room to expand and grow. I think you said your sister planted like that. That was something I hope someone explained to her, that she was going to have to go in later and thin it out. It'll do it naturally, but usually people thin it out just for the health.
I mean, I think it's grown. It'll be too late to wait 20 years. It's done so well. In 5 years, it's already taking over. And I know she has a plan. I reviewed it. I'll have to go back because it might be that she needs to contact the DNR or whatever program she was part of and have them come back, or I can help her assess the trees. But it just seems like that. Yeah, I was just curious what your take was on that. So thanks for that information. And my second question had to do with, there's a lot of emphasis, of course, it's called the Tree Troopers training, but I was curious about how you promote understory growth. That's a really big deal here, of course, in our urban settings, where even in established tree canopy, we don't have a really healthy understory. So do you encourage, or do you develop plans well, I guess I'll back up and say, are you assuming that understory species are just going to drift in or be deposited by birds? Or do you have a follow-up plan for some of these sites where you're mostly installing trees and shrubs for coming back in with the understory, like forbs and grasses and so forth? I just was curious about that, like bringing that diversity all the way through the layers.
So unfortunately, we don't have an understory. You can blame that a lot on the deer.
Yeah.
They just destroy everything. It's really hard to plant an understory. I used to have landowners come to me with mature woods with no understory, and they're like, well, I want an understory. It's not good for the wildlife. There's not a lot of habitat without that understory. So you can kind of like clear areas if you want, like if you have any trees that maybe are invasive or not as great for wildlife or whatever your goals are, you could remove those You could do less invasive practices like hinge cuts, where you just cut the tree and let it fall over. That would open up the sunlight, but it would also have a purpose for habitat. You have to be careful with that though, because all that sunlight can bring in invasive species. And it kind of goes back to when you're picking trees for the site, we try to pick, some shade tolerant, some shade intolerant, try to kind of mock that understory. But it's a difficult task.
It is. Yeah, absolutely. I think in urban settings, maybe that are more controlled, there might be an opportunity for some of us in our plannings when it's a smaller site to introduce some of that, but I definitely can see the challenge in larger, bigger areas. But I participated in the Severn River Association talk, and they were talking about beaver and the role of beaver in riparian. What was fascinating is that the beaver creates, basically an understory through their activity. So sometimes we can let nature do the work like that in certain circumstances. But thank you for answering my question. Appreciate it.
No problem.
And then next, I got a question from Mary Mulvihill. Mary, if you wanted to unmute.
Sure, thank you. Just trying to think through the logistics of the assembly line approach to a volunteer tree planting. And could you go into a little more detail? For example, would you schedule a first group of folks at a certain time to do the digging, and then a second group of volunteers at another time to put the plants in, and so on?
That's definitely smart to schedule smaller groups at different times, especially because of COVID. I'm pretty sure that's what we're going to be doing next month. But say your group comes at one time. Sometimes even if I have some extra time, I'll lay everything out. So every hole or every flag that's supposed to get a hole, you have your shelter there, you have your stake there, and you have everything they need. So you can set that up ahead of time yourself. So when the volunteers get there, you can show the demo, and then you can kind of let them loose and they can go pick a hole or a flag, if they have to dig the hole. Or if you could schedule them on different days, like you mentioned. So you could have kind of like a site prep group where they go and lay everything out for you on a Saturday, and then you could have some people come in on a Sunday and finish it up. Really, it's whatever works best for your volunteers, and just your time commitment and theirs.
Thank you.
And then next, I'll throw it over to Mary Borland. Mary, if you wanted to unmute.
Yeah, I just was wondering, the logistics of watering all those trees, and maybe when you first plant them, but how do you continue to water them? Some of them just look really remote, and without having like a water tank or something, I don't know, it just seemed like a real problem to me.
Yeah, that's definitely one of the most challenging things. If you're planting like a large reforestation site with bare root tree seedlings that they're really dense, that 544 trees to the acre, we don't water those. That's why we plant so dense. And bare root seedlings, they don't have a lot of root mass, so they actually don't need that much water in the beginning. But if you're planting those large container trees or ball and burlap, they are going to need a lot of water. There might be a stream nearby that you could use. The county might be able to help you out. I know I've had some county partners come and help water, but they can also tend to be pretty busy. The Forest Service has fire trucks. They're just normal looking, trucks on the road, not like big fire trucks, but they have water tanks. They might be able to help you out. I know that they make like bags to put on your back, and they hold like 2 gallons of water, and it's like a backpack sprayer that you can walk around and fill with water. But just try the best you can. If it's raining that week, maybe you don't have to get out there, but if you go through like a dry spell, you definitely want to try to water it if you can.
So how often do you have to water? I mean, some of them you have to water every week, or it just seems like I know I want to plant a tree, you know, in the neighborhood, and it's like there's no water there, and
You can also use water bags. They have to be refilled, but that's also an option if you can't get water to the site.
Yeah, typically, Mary, you want the trees to get about an inch of rain per week. So if you're noticing that, we're having a drought and they haven't gotten rain in about 7 days, then that's when you need to make sure that you're watering. And typically, we're lucky where in the springs, we tend to have enough water. So it's mainly a big thing in the summertime, those droughts.
so generally you wouldn't want to plant now. You would wait till fall now, I would suppose.
We would probably plant for the next couple of weeks.
Okay.
But yeah, you're gonna have to get your trees through the summer. So it's definitely something to think about whether you're planting in the spring or the fall. And then next, I believe I had a question come in from Lynn Michael, if you wanna unmute.
Okay, regarding the watering, if we are planting in the fall, would that one of those water gators last like for the rest of the winter, or would it be just for a week or two, or?
I don't have a ton of experience with those water bags. You don't really have to water through the winter. It's really kind of just like that spring to fall that you should be worried about. Typically we do get enough water, like Gray said. It's just, during those droughts.
Okay, so I'm sorry, that came up from the last conversation. My actual question was, and Josh is familiar with our site, we have a large rec area that has trees on 3 sides, fairly forested, but there's a huge amount of various types of invasives in it, like English ivy climbing up some of the trees and wineberry and a bunch of other junk. Would it make sense to get rid of as many of the invasives as we can beforehand, either through manual labor or through a bush hog, rather than trying to plant? The goal was maybe to plant some flowering trees along the edge of the forested area on 2 or 3 sides eventually. I mean, obviously phasing it, but you mentioned just having with the dense tree covered invasives would die. Well, they're going crazy in there. I don't think they're going to go away on their own. So would it make sense to get rid of as many as possible before planting anything?
Definitely. You always want to it's easier to just get rid of them now, especially if you wait. They're going to grow, they're going to spread their seed. They're invasive. They grow way faster than some of our natives. So if you have the ability, definitely get them out of there.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, next I saw a question come in from Gavin. Again, Gavin, if you wanted to ask your question.
Yeah. Are there any efforts that you all are aware of to reintroduce predators like wolf or bobcat to Maryland to kind of regulate some of those deer populations? And in more suburban, urban areas, how are the deer infestations treated?
The bobcat stuff would be a good question for Fish and Wildlife. I'm not exactly sure about introducing some predators in, but in urban sites, you might be able to fence off the area if it's smaller. You do still get deer in urban sites because a lot of the times they're kind of pushed out of their habitat, which is one of the problems. Just because of all the development, there's not a lot of area for them to go. So they're usually everywhere. But did you have something to say, Gray, about the?
I was just gonna comment that I haven't heard anything, but this is one of my favorite conversations. I know that Colorado specifically has just introduced legislation to bring back wolves, so I was just gonna say if you didn't know about that, to maybe keep an eye on how
We contributed to it.
that's awesome.
So, and how do you estimate what would be more effective, like building an exclosure for an area vice, a protective tube? I mean, obviously a lot of time and material goes into building an exclosure, but I mean, is there like a formula for weighing that, or?
So if you're gonna put a fence up, the fence is gonna have to be 8-9 feet tall, because deer can jump that high. So that's definitely something to think about. I honestly would just I guess the fence is better, because if you ever cage the deer, or like a tree shelter, the deer can still, come and chew off the top. So I guess the fence would be better, but typically fencing is just outrageous because it has to be so tall. I've only used fencing once. It's really expensive. So I would suggest the shelters or the cages, but if you have the budget, I would go ahead with the fencing if you want. I guess it's really just based on your budget. I think all work pretty well.
And then next, Ann Jackson asked in the chat if you could just say a little bit more about the Forest Service helping with watering. She was wondering how you find them.
You can just Forest Service, Google that, and then the state website will come up. There's usually like a contact by region, but they have fire trucks, and I've known a couple people that have gone out and watered some of my plantings, but they're usually pretty busy, and they don't really have that built into their schedule. But I guess if they're feeling nice and they have some extra time and want to get out, they could help you out. Something worth a shot, I think.
Yeah, and I will just signpost to everyone that is going to be one of the biggest things to think about when you're thinking through your planting plan, is how you're going to water these trees, because we do expect that there is a solid maintenance plan. So if you're thinking about putting some trees out in the forested part of your communities that are maybe hard to access, coming up with like a creative plan to address that. Some people will have like an adopt a tree kind of program in their neighborhood where families can sign up to go and water that tree once a week, and they're responsible for watering that tree just to help delegate. But just starting to put this in your head of like, if I'm going to plant these trees somewhere, how are we going to maintain them? And then next, I saw a couple of questions come in from the Novickies. If you wanted to ask your questions, and I think we might have to, after these questions, cut off questions for now. Go for it.
Yeah, we had a couple questions. One, can trees be purchased from the Aton Nursery, the Maryland Aton Nursery, at a reduced rate? Also, are there certain trees that beavers don't want to chew down? I mean, we had a beaver pond in the back, and it left and it turned into a swamp because it wiped out all the trees in that area. And two other things is, one, the backyard buffer program. Thank you. We participated in it this year, and I'm using a trash can, hauling it in the tractor, my John Deere tractor, to get the water to water the trees, so you can haul more water at once. But also, a few years back, when my boys were in Boy Scouts here in Davidsonville, Maryland, the troop was eligible to get grants money that's available from the local landfills. From the trucks, they pay a certain fee to offset their adverse effects to the local area. And I think those grants would be available for using in the tree programs also. So that's a bunch of stuff.
I'm more concerned about the beaver getting at, it was a rogue beaver, but it looks like we got another rogue beaver 5 years later that's attacking what trees didn't die in the swamp or put to use in the dam. So are there any trees that beavers don't like?
I don't know any specific trees that beavers don't like. Whenever landowners have beavers, I always just tell them to cage their trees, so the beaver can't get to them. But I can look into that. I wonder if there are any resistant. I'm curious about that. Because I know. Oh, go ahead.
No, go ahead, Brittany.
I was just gonna say, like, deer don't like sycamore. So there is that, but I don't know any beaver trees.
And as we get into these conversations, keep in mind that the beavers are a big part of the ecology. So it's like a deer eating trees or plants or whatever, if it's not being nibbled on. And Gavin's exactly right. I train some master gardeners for stormwater, and I always tell them to think like beavers. That's really the best way to kind of work through things when it comes to stormwater. But with that, we are going to close off questions for now. If we have some time at the end, we'll come back to the ones that haven't been answered. But I do need a little bit of time to go over how to produce the actual planting plan in GIS. I do want to say that Brittany covered a lot of information, a lot of the logistics of a project. And as we're going to get into next week, we'll be talking about the maintenance aspects. We'll talk about the implementation aspects. So a lot of the stuff that Brittany has talked about tonight is going to be kind of broken up over some more digestible, easy to manage pieces as you guys move forward with the projects after Brittany's done with the training. So keep a lot of those questions in mind for next week, and we'll definitely cover them, and we'll go from there. But with that, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And for folks who had the opportunity to, can everybody hear me okay? Okay, I don't have my headset on tonight, so I'm not looking like I'm flying a plane. Is everybody good? I think my screen just froze. Did I lose you guys?
We can still hear you, but I'm not seeing what you're trying to share pop up.
Okay, let me see. So you can't see my screen?
No, screen.
That is really strange. Let me try to stop this share here.
It says you have started screen sharing, but nothing shows up.
Let me try again. If this doesn't work, we might have to do another video, which won't be too big of a deal. How's that?
It's showing up.
Okay. So this should look really familiar to folks who had a chance to review the GIS stuff. I'm going to go a little quickly. Before I jump into this, I just want to signpost here at the offset that this can be a little intimidating for folks. So I just want to signpost that I have office hours every Wednesday between 1 and 3 half-hour intervals. So as you guys are kind of working through putting your site plans together and working with GIS, I'm more than happy to work with you during that time frame. But beyond that, we're also happy to set up times outside of those time slots to work with you too. So don't get too intimidated. Just try to follow along, and we'll kind of go from there. So if you remember with our videos, I'm going to find a quick address here to kind of show what's going on. So I'm going up to I-12, and I'm typing in slowly the address, and I'm hitting search. And a little yellow circle with a blue outline comes up. So I'm going to zoom into that using my mouse. I can also go up here to this plus or minus, and that will allow me to zoom into. But you can see that it's centered on this house, okay? So one thing that I really want to show right off the bat, I'm going over to my layer list here. And the first thing that I'm going to turn on for producing this map is going to be the parcels list. And I just really want to make this really, really important. Like, everybody put a star if you're taking notes. As you're putting your planting plan together, you need to make sure that you're within the parcel that you're wanting to work on. I know that sounds silly, but we've run into that a bit with folks. The other thing that I want to show here, using my identify tool, is I'm just going to kind of highlight this, and I'm going to try to get to the tax account information. So this will bring up the property information, and it's going to take us to the state's data. You'll see here under the owner name, these folks, and I just want to signpost that when we're working through these projects, keep that in mind, as that's going to be the person or the entity that you're going to need to get permission from to do your project, okay? So that's something that we'll talk about a little bit more next week, but that's really important just to keep in mind as we're moving forward. So I'm going to zoom in here a little bit more. And for our purposes, this is probably pretty much the base that we're going to be looking for. Would you agree, Gray? We don't need to have a lot of other layers on or anything like that. But I'm also going to pull up here. I've started here just a very simple planting plan key. So I have A being Cornus florida, which is the flowering dogwood. And I have B being the Quercus alba, which is the white oak. And you can see that I'm trying to put 3 dogwoods here and 1 oak on this map, okay? So I'm going to go back to my GIS. I'm going to go up to my Tools tab. And here under Draw, you have a couple options. Now, I'm going to use the point here and hit point. And when the tool turns blue and grows a triangle, that means it's ready to use. So I'm going to go ahead and put a point right here, if it's going to let me do it. I'm having some connectivity issues, guys, so please just bear with me. I'm going to put 1 dogwood, or I'm going to put 1 dot there. Does everybody see that? I'm going to put another dot here. And then I'm going to put 2 more over here. Now, this is after we've done site analysis. This is after we know that these are the correct positions for this. We'll get into that as we get into the project. So those are going to be the basis of where our trees are going. So then I'm going to go up to this drop down, the side point, and I'm going to choose the T for text. Does everybody see that? So I'm going to hit that, and I'm going to create a text box beside each of these dots. So it's going to come up with an enter your text option. So I'm going to cancel this for 1 second. So this dot, everyone can see my cursor? So this dot and these 2 dots are going to be our dogwoods. And then this dot is going to be our oak tree, okay? So that means I need to put, if you remember my planting plan, right? A is going to denote our dogwood. Does that make sense to everyone? So I'm going to put an A beside the first dot. I'm going to do it again here. Put another A in. Same thing here. Why is it not letting me do it? There we go. And then remember that B is our oak tree. So we have the letters denoting what the trees are pretty close to the dot, so it's relatively easy to read. So then we're going to go up to print here. And you'll remember from the last video with the GIS that I can reposition this. And just for ease of use, we're going to position that with the crosshairs right over the house so that we can see it. For the title, Gray, how are we supposed to be titling our maps?
For the title, it tends to be the project name and then putting in whether it's the draft site plan or the finalized site plan, and then putting it off, ending it with the address and homeowner's last name.
So the project name is typically the tree trooper's last name, right? And I'm looking right at Lynn Michael, so I'm going to use Lynn Michael's name here. And then walk through it one more time because I am not listening.
Yeah, so then underscore, you can put in the address.
Okay, so we're just going to do 14. Okay.
Underscore draft site plan, or if it's your final. And then underscore final part is just the last name of the homeowner. So
I'm going to put my name in, although you guys probably saw what I said there. And this will make a lot more sense as we work through the process. Again, this is a lot of information, but I'm just trying to show you folks what the final product is we're kind of looking at, because we're trying to make sure that all of the site plans that we're looking at are kind of standardized and easy to use for you folks or for the contractors if we end up using them. A few other things to keep in mind, we're going to have it output as a PDF. I'm going to turn up the resolution here, which means it's not going to be pixelated. It'll be a little easier to read. And then from there, I'm going to hit print. So you see that the GIS is thinking. You don't want to make it mad, so we're just going to let it do that. But when it's ready, it's going to say open file. So I'm going to hit open file. And that will spit out here a site plan, if all goes according to plan. Let's see. There we go. So you can see that this will print it at an 8.5 by 11 if you were to print that. But you see that our parcel is highlighted. We have all of our trees kind of laid out. And so if you were to submit your site plan, you would submit the PDF, which you can download up here, along with your planting plan key. Okay, so I know that was a lot of information. Like I said, we'll walk through this again. This is just an introduction tonight. But I can field any questions, or we can turn it back over to Brittany to finalize the other questions.
Josh, are you able to establish a different color for different dots to connote different trees, or no?
That's a great question, Lynn. With this GIS, unfortunately, no, because this is the free software, that sort of thing. But that's why your naming convention is really important, and making sure that you have your labels as close to your dots as possible. This is a little bit different from what Brittany was showing with some of the restoration plantings. A lot of the projects that you folks are going to be getting into are going to really be centered on individual trees like this. So it should be relatively easy to use. But if we get into a situation where we're looking at something that's going to be a little bit more dense, that will be a conversation to have with me or Gray or someone in the office to kind of figure out how best to produce your map. So again, every site is different. Every project is going to be different. So we'll be able to handle a lot of that on a case-by-case basis. I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing here. As I'm thinking about this, what I will probably do is put together another video, that way you guys have all of this for reference and you can go back to this. I think that'll probably be the easiest. I'm looking at your questions here. Yep, so it'll either be a video or plus a cheat sheet answering Lisa's question. Mary, you can dimension between the trees. Again, this is hopefully done after you do your initial site visit. You have an idea of where things are going to kind of fall and lie within the site boundaries and all of that. But we can cross that bridge when we come to it. There's a measurement tool for sure. And then Lisa asked if you could use different shapes. So the easiest thing for this application is using the point, because it does make a circle. There are other ways to draw with GIS. It would be polygons, which would be like multi-sided polygons. I guess that's what a polygon is, right? And that's probably more in line with what you saw with Brittany's plans, but that's more for the larger scale restoration things. But we can absolutely, again, if your site calls for it, that's what we'll use. But again, I don't want anyone to freak out about the GIS. We're here to help. We're just trying to standardize how they come into the office and how they kind of get disseminated. So if there's no other questions on the GIS, Gray, do we want to go back to finalizing some of Brittany's questions? And we might even be able to finish up a little early tonight.
Yeah, I'm not sure if I saw any other questions come through.
So I'm going to answer. So I just saw Lisa's question come through again, and this is the same idea as the question about the different colored dots. Again, this is why it's important to really be tight on your naming convention and making sure that it's as close to your dot as possible.
And then Brittany, were you trying to say something?
I never answered the one question about the state tree nursery, the John S. Ayton State Tree Nursery. You can buy seedlings from Balk. They're the bare root seedlings. That's all they sell. They open up their orders to order in October. You can order from October to March, and then you pick up tree seedlings in March, and you can only plant during the spring. So they don't do any fall, but they have a bare minimum bare minimum order of like 25, I think. So you at least have to get 25. But I mean, you can order 1,000 loblolly, and I think it's like $250 or something very cheap. So that the more you buy, the cheaper it is. It's especially good for reforestation.
I didn't get the name that you just said. What was it?
It's John S. Ayton, Ayton, State Tree Nursery. I can type it in the chat. And it's in Preston, Maryland.
Awesome. So it sounds like we're ending a little bit early this evening. I'm happy to stay on another like 5-10 minutes if there are any other questions, but Josh, were you going to say something? You're muted.
Bill, do you want to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Yeah, I'm just curious about maintenance. I know on a lot of environmental projects, it's a big deal, get everything set up and get it all in planted, and then it kind of gets neglected or forgotten about. And I'm wondering, is there any kind of service and is there service money included in these grant proposals? And is there any kind of a commercial service that actually would do this maintenance on these projects? Or does the Forest Service do it with their personnel? How does that work?
Usually when you apply for grants, if you're applying for a grant to plant something, they're going to require you to show that maintenance schedule. And it's usually like a sustainability one, so it has to last into the future. Sometimes, depending on your program, it might have a maintenance plan built in. So for example, the Alliance's Healthy Forest, Healthy Waters program, they offer maintenance for 2 years, sometimes 3 years. It's really just to get you through that establishment period, which is that 3 years. Depending on like the cost share or the funding assistance you get, they may give you some money to put towards maintenance. But it's definitely difficult trying to find maintenance. Some of our contractors will do maintenance, but it's just going to be contractor specific. One thing I think we really need to get going is a training session for like lawn care companies and people like that, to get trained on how to care for these tree buffers, like tree reforestation, because it's a lot different than just like your landscaping.
How many of these projects are there around the area in Anne Arundel County, for example?
Gray and Josh might have a better idea for Anne Arundel County.
So that actually, let me just kind of dovetail with what Brittany is saying. I want to just signpost for the replant efforts for the projects that you folks are going to be getting into. Part of the commitment of a tree trooper is actually making sure that the trees are surviving, and you're going to be helping to monitor the trees. So a big part of that is also developing a maintenance plan specific to your projects. So that's something we'll talk about a little bit more next week. We'll talk a little bit more also about the copay that goes into these projects, and that ranges depending on how you're planning on installing. But that copay goes directly to a maintenance fund. So that money will be available if it's needed to help maintain those. And going off of what Brittany was saying about training for folks like lawn care folks, we're also working with the Chesapeake Bay landscape professionals to develop a workshop for landscape professionals in county that would be tree specific. So that would be something that would be included in that, and hopefully a labor force that we can tap for our maintenance needs. In regards to the number of projects, I can't speak directly to all of the reforestation projects, but Ray, how many projects went into the ground last year for 2020 and how many are going in for the first round this year for the tree trooper projects?
Yeah, so we had 28 tree trooper projects go in the ground last year. And then for the first round this year for spring installations, I want to say we have 7 more projects going in the ground for a total of 440 trees this spring.
And the total tree trooper trees for last year was well over 2,000, right?
It was like 1917, I think, was the final number. Yeah. So,
Josh, are you working with Beth then for the CBLP stuff? So I took the landscaper for my community to my class when they did this, and and he's Hispanic, and so he brought 2 of his staff, but it was really not easily led. They just didn't get what they needed to out of the course. So can you try to work towards having a Spanish speaker there?
Allison, I'm actually now on the steering committee for CBLP.
You are fantastic.
So we are working towards all of those DEIJ goals, making sure that it is completely accessible. So yes, there's a lot of conversation to do that for sure. Because at the end of the day, a lot of folks that are in the industry are Spanish speakers. So making sure that they're able to understand and fully get the concepts and make sure they're doing things the right way, it absolutely has to be accessible.
Yeah, right.
That's a very good point.
I really apologize for being late. I had something urgent and I just
You're fine, Allison. And that's a great reminder, folks. This has been recorded, so you can as it'll probably be completely being honest, I'm off tomorrow, so this will probably be up on Friday. But it will be on the Tree Trooper only page that you guys can kind of access and review at your own leisure.
if we start getting commitments now for people that want to plant trees in the fall, but they don't want to plant a 5-gallon tree, they want to plant a 15 or 25 gallon or B&B, is that going to be fine?
So we'll talk about that more next week. The tree menu that you guys will be choosing from are going to be from the resilient species list, and they are going to be 6-foot trees. That's what the budget allows for. Now, if they wanted to buy into getting a bigger tree, that could be worked out on an individual basis, especially with the tree trooper. But that's just a little bit more paperwork and a little bit more logistics. But I don't think that's out of the realm of possibility. Okay, and Gray just put into the chat the session assessment. So if folks can remember to do that, that would be really helpful. But I think with that, Brittany, again, thank you so much. This was great. Thank you all for joining us. And again, if other questions come up as you're kind of digesting all of this, don't hesitate to shoot us an email and we'll try to respond as quickly as we can. But stay warm out there. I think we're dipping into the 30s again. Hopefully you guys didn't plant your tomatoes yet. It's a little early, but have a great evening.
bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.